Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream.
You need to tell me what happened.
Merrily, 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 merrily.
You need to take me there.
I don't know what the master told you to expect.
Who is that? Is someone there with you?
He's back.
You can smell it.
I thought you were a ghost.
There are no ghosts here.
You see what we see, don't you? You know what we... I think God has forsaken this place. I believe I've seen hell. And it's white. It's snow white.
Mr. Rochester has a wife, now living.
Who are you?
My name's Briggs, a solicitor.
And you would thrust on me a wife?
I would remind you of her existence, sir, which the law recognizes if you do not.
I have no wife.
Edward Fairfax Rochester of Thornfield Hall was married to Bertha Antoinetta Mason at San Benedictus Church in Spanish Town, Jamaica, on the 18th day of March, 1825.
If that is a genuine document, it doesn't prove that the woman mentioned there is still living.
She was living 3 months ago.
Writer Sandy Welch is particularly struck by Jane Eyre's independence of spirit.
Jane is a very modern character, even if you faithfully take everything from the book. I mean, she's a woman who's decided to earn her own living.
Yeah.
She's very keen to do that. Whenever she's in trouble, which is often, she thinks, well, I'll just go and I'll advertise and I'll make some money that way. And that is a very modern feeling. I think everybody in the 21st century can relate to that.
All right, so Sandy, welcome.
Hi, am I?
There you are, hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and see you perfectly. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Well, it's very, very kind of you to ask me. I'm very impressed with your day. How's it been going?
It's been excellent. It's been really, really good. So everyone, I'm sure, is very excited to hear you talk about your adaptation of Jane Eyre. So we'll just jump in.
Okay.
So, Sandy, there's so many classic novels that could be adapted. What drew you to Jane Eyre?
Well, not to mean this facetiously, but what drew me in first was that someone asked me to do it. The BBC said, would you like to do it? And I said, absolutely. And I was particularly keen to do it in a long form. They wanted 4 hours. And I was very keen to do it in a longer form than you normally see Jane Eyre, which is in a 2-hour format. I mean, it is one of those novels, because it has so much incident and drama, and obviously a huge relationship. It is one of those books that people think, oh, well, you can do it in 2 hours. But I was very keen to open it up and see what was there and, you know, hopefully make it as compulsive reading for another generation of young women and men, hopefully. Because I grew up, my love for the classics was BBC born, and I watched them and then I read them. And in those days, it was regrettably quite a while ago when I was little, they were in very long form. I mean, a long form meant 26 episodes, half hours. So they could literally do a chapter a week. So you did get to know the books as a larger entity than I think maybe, what with shooting and how expensive it is to do classic drama, they tend to get shorter and shorter. So you get less of the detail of the books, maybe.
Yeah, and in a novel like Jane Eyre, where you need so much time because there's so much character development, I can imagine that the serial format suits that and allows you to flesh out those characters a lot more vividly than you might get, let's say, in a 2-hour film.
Yes, I think that's right. I think, especially with Jane, I think that in a 2-hour film, you get to the burning bed, Rochester being fire all around him, really rather quickly, and certainly rather quickly after Jane gets to Thornfield. And you don't get the opportunity to see those long walks they did. There's 2 months of relationship.
Yeah, there's quite a long sort of courtship involved, isn't it, building up to that. So did you research other adaptations of Jane Eyre in preparation for yours, or did you approach it afresh?
I did it afresh, I think partly because I couldn't remember any of the long form ones. The last one, the last adaptation that really impressed me was the Orson Welles one, you know, the 1940 film. And I was thinking about that, and I looked at the poster of that, and what was very interesting about that poster is it's very similar to the 1940 poster of Rebecca. And Jane plays Rebecca, and then she plays...
self-veiled adaptation of Jane Eyre, isn't it?
Exactly. So, but I think that the casting of Joan Fontaine did tend to, you know, she's a very submissive character in Rebecca, and I'm sure they were hoping for the same sort of success with this. So I think it fixed in people's minds that maybe Jane was a more submissive character than you get from the book. You know, you don't get that emotional undertow until...
Right. So that sort of leads us into our next question. So Jane's character as both a child and an adult is one that really continues to resonate with audiences today. So what was your vision for Jane, the child, versus Jane, the adult? And I guess a follow-up to that is, to what extent were you writing Jane as a modern figure that a 21st century audience could identify with?
Well, I think when you read the book, you are terribly struck by how modern it seems, how direct it seems, how direct the prose is, and how very clear the thought processes are. There's no ornate language in either the prose or the dialogue. And that's what I think makes her such a universal character. And obviously part of her appeal comes from her childhood. She has this horrible, loveless childhood, which you see throughout the book. She manages to bring under control somehow. So when she goes back to see her aunt, she doesn't rush away as soon as, you know, the aunt says, "Go away, I hate you," or says something horrible to her, because it's absolutely merciless, Mrs. Reed's dialogue to Jane when she appears. But she sticks it out. She sits there, she sticks it out, because she knows this is the way I get to take control of my destiny. It's not really about winning. I think it's about, I'll be in control of this. And she still has compassion left from that. And it's such a marvelous character and such a wonderful journey she takes that I think that is, you know, the main duty of doing the book is to impress upon people what a wonderful creation she is.
And a real strong sense of her own value.
Yes.
You know, that's one of the things that strikes me so much, particularly in your adaptation, is she has this real sense of herself, you know, apart from everyone else. She doesn't allow all of herself to be subordinated in that way, at least in spirit. So, Mr. Rochester, we like to talk about Rochester. Of course, he continues to be a really provocative character for many people. What were your views on him as he appears in Charlotte's novel versus how you wanted to sort of portray him on screen? So did you see huge differences, or were you being, do you think, faithful to the novel?
Well, I think my main aim in doing any book, regardless of whether they rank amongst my favourites, and I have been lucky to do many of my favourites, luckier than most, I think it's the duty to try and put across what the author wants, really, as opposed to what I would like. Rochester's obviously a huge character, and he's a huge part of the appeal of the book. I mean, I don't think one can pretend otherwise. I realise that there is a very large anti-Rochester contingent amongst Bronte fans and non-Bronte fans, and fans of the book and non-fans of the book. But I think it's terribly clear from the book that Charlotte Bronte wants us to like him. I cannot see any other way of interpreting it. He does. Jane deserves him. Jane is equal to him, but equally he's equal to her. He becomes a character who helps her grow, and who in the end becomes, great fulfillment to her. So it wouldn't be right to see him as some sort of barrier to her independence. That is, not what I don't think that's what Bronte intended at all.
He often comes across on screen as a very one-dimensional, very Byronic hero, or sometimes even a sort of anti-hero. And I think in your adaptation, that you just sort of strike that complexity really, really well. And I guess following on from that, one of the notable things about your characterization of Rochester are that his emotions are more visible. His vulnerability comes to the surface that we don't often see in a lot of the adaptations prior to yours. So is that something you intended? And did you feel that as a series you had time to explore, I guess, this aspect of his character more fully?
Yes, I think, one of the things that often doesn't come across in a shorter version is the humour, is the intelligence, and the connection with Jane. He has this connection with her straight away. It's as if his whole life has been run by fools and knaves, and suddenly someone very genuine appears to him and shows him what might be a relationship with someone else. And I thought that was really important to get. So the long scenes between Jane and Rochester, where their emotions are allowed to develop. So, so he can go from being quite surly and abrupt and rude, although he's rude to her, but he's especially rude to Adele, I think, in those, so she can take him up on that later on. But there is room for you to see it going from surliness to her having an effect on him, and him changing and becoming a more complex character. And I'm absolutely sure that is what is intended in the book. Yeah.
And that's achieved so well in your series, because I remember that one moment by the river when he sort of chastises Adele or calls her ridiculous or something, and she sort of gets up and says, "Oh, he says I'm ridiculous," or I can't remember the exact word, but Jane sort of gives him that, in the reverse shot, she gives him that sort of knowing look, and he registers that, and he sort of comes over to her and corrects his behavior a little bit. And I thought that was just so beautifully done.
Well, yes, I mean, he does ask her about Adele. He does, and he does want her opinion, because he's come to believe that she is, a guiding light, that her truthfulness and her authenticity as a person.
And he so respects her intelligence, and we see that.
Yeah.
So in adaptations of Jane Eyre, Bertha often appears on a sort of spectrum. So sometimes she's more wild and animalistic, and in others she's really quite subdued. In your production, she's incredibly exoticized and seductive. And that's sort of part of her danger in that adaptation. So particularly when we get into the third floor at Thornfield. Can you tell us a bit about your approach to Bertha?
Well, obviously there was a lot of discussion about Bertha, and I did spend an awful lot of time reading the book and trying to work out Bronte. What did Bronte think of Bertha? Why is she in the story? What does she represent? And it seems that you can go two ways. You can either have her as someone who is so completely beyond the pale that you can't find any sympathy with her. On the other hand, you don't want to portray her as a character who is a bit nervous, and just with a little bit more effort on anyone's part could have been made to have a fulfilling life. I think that what Bronte really wanted was someone who is not redeemable, unfortunately, and that's not what she's interested in at that moment. It's about you know, how Rochester has tried to take care of her.
Right.
And also the idea of it being a bit exotic is also to try and understand how Rochester, you know, to get across this idea of the story of him being deceived by his father and his brother into marrying this very rich woman, and immediately seeing the mistake. Rather than
and I think I had this conversation the other day about how people often forget that part of his past, that he was deceived into this, and also his treatment of Bertha. I mean, we were talking about how, you know, in the 19th century, as her husband, he would have had well within his rights to put her into an asylum, and he doesn't do that.
Well, exactly. I mean, in England, I mean, there are very well documented cases of people well into the 20th century being troublesome women, being
indeed
slightly eccentric people who didn't obey what they were supposed to do, being just shut up and their marriages annulled. And so that was a relatively simple thing to do.
Yes.
But he chose, I do feel that that's what Bronte means, that he did try and take care of her. He did try and do his best. Clearly, he shouldn't have tried to marry someone else while he was married to her. But in his eyes, he was doing as well as he could.
Right. So do you think that Charlotte Bronte was sort of herself using Bertha as a sort of plot device? Or do you think that Charlotte saw her as a more fully fledged character?
I don't see. I look very carefully, and because you know that Charlotte Bronte is not a callous person, clearly not, and neither is Jane, a character, then I suppose I think she probably thought with modern day medicine, maybe someone who's maybe on a life support machine or something, who is not, I don't know. I mean, I'm beginning to stray into dangerous ground here, but I think you always do when you're talking about Bertha, because it's so difficult from where we come from, not to emphasize with Bertha. But I'm not clear that Bertha, I'm not clear what Bronte really thought. I just think that every person who adapts the novel tries their hardest to tell the story that they think she wants to tell. Bronte.
Right.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, and of course it brings in, you know, the conversation we have now in the 21st century about mental health perspectives in the 19th century, which, you know, we'll get to some of that perhaps later with Adam Negatus. What was your role in the production side? For instance, did you have a part in the casting of the wonderful Toby Stephens and Ruth Wilson for the lead characters?
Well, I always try very hard to have an effect on the casting. It depends on who you're working with. But obviously, Philippa and I worked on quite a lot of adaptations and many classical ones before that, and there's a certain amount of trust had grown between us, and so I think we were both very keen to have someone a little younger than the George C. Scott kind of, because it would help, because Ruth obviously does look very young, so you don't want, you know, Rochester's supposed to be about 37, 38 in the book.
No, it's described as middle age, but middle age for the Victorian era. Right?
Exactly. So you don't want it to look like, you know, someone's grandfather. You know, and you are inviting problems with the relationship if you do that. And his vigorousness and the fact that you will then be able to see him as the, you know, potentially glittering character he was going to be. And when Mrs. Fairfax says, you know, he's the life and soul of the party, you don't suppose she's lying. Suppose she remembers him as a young man with expectations and a life to lead, who is charismatic in company. Whereas some of the, you know, people who played Rochester, you would find it hard to believe they were the life and soul of the party at any time of their lives. So it was a question of trying to find someone with a sense of humour, who could do the humour, who could do the intelligence, as well as, you know, the torment, really.
And how did Toby approach that role? Did he know much about Rochester before he came to the series?
I'm not sure, actually. I didn't talk to him about that, but I do think that he was very serious about it. But I do think one of the good things about dramatising Jane Eyre is that Rochester is a character that everyone knows, and for male actors, sometimes it's quite hard to find a leading actor who's going to play the lover, like in Emma, or in, you know, when the novel is called Emma, the novel is called Jane Eyre. I think everybody knows the name Rochester, and that it's a powerful, charismatic role. So I think
interesting. And what about Ruth? What was her approach to Jane?
I think Ruth was just so brilliant. We were so lucky to get her.
She came straight out of drama school, didn't she?
Certainly, she auditioned straight out of drama school. I think she might have done a role in between casting but definitely it was her first big role, and she just embodied the character and was so full of emotion and so authentic. You know, it's such a
that strength and that vulnerability is so well balanced in her performance as well.
Yes, that's right. And you always feel there's a motor going. You always feel there's an intelligence and a compassion, sensibility that is really very attractive is the wrong word, but it you know, she lets you in as an actress too.
And I'm sort of going to go off script a little bit because I do have a question, and I'm sure some of our audience members are interested in this aspect of the adaptation as well. But that wonderful moment when we have Jane kind of introduced to Rochester before he arrives on the scene, when she goes into his study. Yeah. What inspired you to do that? Because it was so brilliantly done.
Well, there is this marvelous thing. We were talking about advertising before, and how I've forgotten about that interview watching. I just saw it, so I was very keen to, you know, connect with modern women, and I thought that, you know, her saying I'm going to advertise, and as soon as Miss Temple goes, she wants to be off from Lowood and she wants to advertise, and on the way to Thornfield, she's already thinking, well, maybe if I don't like this job, I'll be off somewhere else. Then when she gets there, she's a bit bored and thinks maybe I'll be off somewhere else, I'll advertise again. But then he's a mysterious figure, and Mrs. Fairfax says, oh, he's going to come and then he's going to go. He'll be here for a night maybe, and then he'll go off again. So obviously he's quite intriguing. And there is this part of his character. He is, you know, he does give them a botany lesson. He is interested in the natural world, and, you know, so it led on from that, really.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Job in there wasn't like a portrait in the hall.
Yeah, and sort of getting to know him through his intellectual interests as well. And we also introduced through that scene, sort of his ventures abroad as well, and these kind of exotic, you know, lands that he's been to. So just that kind of brings us to our final question before we open it up for a 15-minute Q&A, if you're okay with that. So would you adapt any other Bronte novel? And if so, what might that be?
Well, Villette is obviously a very interesting novel. And I think she's obviously trying out quite a few ideas with that. I wonder if the fact that Rochester and Jane was such a very successful relationship made her wonder about Lucy's relationship with Paul, and, you know, whether she was retreading the same ground in some way or whatever. I sense a certain hesitancy about it. And Shirley, obviously, I mean, it's not a novel that many people know, but it's about the industrial, it's set in an industrial landscape, and people are very interested in period dramas set in industrial landscapes. I love watching them, so I mean that's quite an interesting one to see how one would do that one as well.
So that is your next project, perhaps.
Asked.
All right, so Sandy, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. And I think we'll just open up, because I'm sure people just are bursting with questions now. So we're going to open it up. Let me see. I think my co-host here might be able to do that for me. And if people want to raise their hands if you want to ask Sandy a question, or if you want to just write it in the chat, then I can field those for you. So sorry, Sandy, it takes us a little bit here. Okay, so we've got a question. Yeah, we've just learned technology as we go.
So it's not.
So we have a question from.
You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. It's been, but we're doing all right. So we have a question from Millie Mason, who says that Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea illuminates how Rochester may not be the victim, and instead Bertha is the victim of the situation. Did you find yourself wanting to make Rochester more romantic or sensitive so that the audience forgive his potential mistreatment of Bertha?
Yeah, it's quite a difficult question, that, because I think Wide Sargasso Sea, I mean, it was written over a century after Jane Eyre, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to take someone else's characters and riff on that, if you like, to suit your modern audience. But I'm not sure you should be rewriting the story, especially since the author is long dead and gone. And I think you have to then, you know, challenge the idea that, is this how Rochester behaved? Is, you know, it's obviously a mystery, but clearly Bronte does not want you to feel that he has mistreated Bertha. She clearly wants you to feel that he is the victim of that circumstance, whatever he does afterwards and before that, he was a victim of the circumstance. And I find the idea that he contributed to her madness or her illness or whatever one wants to call it, is I find it very difficult to incorporate in the story that is Jane Eyre.
Right, I can see that.
It is a problematic area, very problematic area, and I don't want to sound too final about these things, but in the end I think you just sort of have to go back to what's there in the book, what is in the book, and what makes sense from what the dramatization you're writing. I mean, people have dramatized Wide Sargasso Sea, and you know, it works very well.
But it's obviously a very different story from Bronte's.
Well, I feel so, but I know that I don't.
We'll see what else is in here. So we've got a question from Erica, who says, your adaptation is my favorite. I absolutely love it. Why did you choose flashbacks to show the scenes between Jane and Rochester before Rochester leaves Thornfield? You made the bold choice for a period drama to show the sensuality between Jane and Rochester. What leads you to this decision?
Before Jane, in the final episode, I think we're talking about episode 4.
Yeah.
So we go from Jane running away from the church, basically, and taking her dress off, which is very upsetting, that scene, I think. It's beautifully done by Susanna and all concerned. And then we do cut, at the beginning of episode 4, we do go straight to her in the wilderness on the moors. And we have no idea how she got there. And that was quite a big decision. And we made it, we had a lot of discussions about it. But I think the problem is that if you follow on the, you know, I have to see to my wife with some long neurotic scenes of him trying to make her stay, or saying, you know, we're going to live together in France. We are going to live as brother and sister, or whatever he gets round to in the end. Jane goes off, then she meets the Rivers, then we have a bit with the Rivers, then we come back to Rochester. So the idea was to kind of have her remembering, have her in extremis on the moor, asking God's forgiveness, or, you know, because she thinks she's going to die, because she is, you know, in terrible straits, and then St. John saves her. Then we have the Rivers, and then it's about her being prompted to remember what happened in their exchanges by what happens with Rivers. It just seemed a way of getting through that rather unwieldy section at the end, and to give you a good sense of time passing, because I think we need to feel it's a year later. And
yeah, flashbacks achieve that, don't they?
Yes. As for the eroticism, I think that's there in the book. I mean, I do think, you know, he does, you know, he wants to impress himself upon her. He's risked everything. He knows she loves him. And we know that Jane is a very passionate person and, you know, has to really work hard.
I think it's implicit. I think you're right. I think it's implicit in the novel. And we have that wonderful moment in the novel where she's just saved him from that fire and she comes back. And it's what I refer to I always refer to it to my students as sort of her sexual awakening, which she realizes, you know, like her heart's pounding and she's just had this really intimate moment with him. And so I think that's, yes, it's artistic license, but I think it's valid artistic license to think that that could have happened. We have, I think, Madeline would like to ask a question. So Madeline, if you want to unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, I typed it to you, so I'll just read it from there. So really quick, just wanted to say thank you for your work on Jane Eyre in North and South. They've been with me through some really rough times, but also some great times, so they're just a blessing. Thank you so much, and I'm fangirling. But for my question, in the Jane Eyre miniseries, you really highlight and emphasize the theme of twins or doubling. We find out that Eshton is studying twins, they're twins at the party, and then when Jane tells Rochester she's going to leave him, he says, we're just like those twins. So although the theme of doubling is of course present in the novel, it's far subtler than that, but the theme of doubling is very much talked about in critical discourse of the novel. So I was wondering, when you approach an adaptation, what do you stand to gain or maybe lose from making explicit the critical discourses surrounding the novel, either by emphasizing or adding elements that were not in the original text? So what's the sort of balancing act? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your kind words. As people say, I'm so pleased because, you know, part of my job is to make people love the books. And so that's really great. I actually wasn't aware of doubling. I'm not very good at critical discourse, which may not be a great thing to say in a symposium of critical discourse. But I'm hopeless, I can't remember things or anything. But I will tell you the reasoning behind the twins, and that is because I wanted Jane to be part of this conversation. Episode 2 is much taken up with Rochester in society coming to Thornfield, and Jane being forced to realise that she's on the outside and not sure about Rochester. And Rochester, of course, is thinking how much nicer she is than these people. But she has to deal with Blanche. She has to deal with Blanche's mother and all the discourse about how awful governesses are and how awful children are, basically. And I wanted Jane to be able to take part in this discourse because she's asked. So it seemed to me that one had to try and make up something that they would say to each other. And so therefore, the idea of the scientist and the twins, I mean, I love the twins, actually. I've got no idea where they came from. But the idea, and also I'm terribly aware that we are going to get somewhere in episode 4 where two people do communicate across hundreds of miles of country. And I wanted to try and dramatize this because I think in the book it's a very religious experience, that is exceptionally difficult to dramatize, you know, by what people do and what they say. So I wanted to get this idea that there could be a connection between people and that Jane and Rochester would be not twinned, but whatever. So I forgive me for not knowing about the doubling. But the answer clearly to your question is I don't take much notice of the discourse. But secondly, I wanted her to be able to hold her own in intelligent conversation, and for the people not to be all horrible, because, you know, Mrs. Ingram's is a horrible person, and so to see some intelligence there other than Rochester, I thought that was a way to get through an hour's television in episode 2.
Well, that's an interesting response, Sandy. We've got just a load of questions coming in, so we've got 10 minutes left. So Anna asks, would you change anything now in your adaptation if you had a chance? Do you still think about it, or is it a closed chapter for you?
I do think about it a lot. I mean, I think it's very nice that people think that you have everything is under your control. You know, that you get to choose which books you want to do, and then you get the casting and whatever. But of course, you know, with filming, with all sorts of in all sorts of ways, you don't always get what you want. I'm very happy with Jane, because I think that there are a lot of things about it that, you know, I'm very proud of. That I'm proud of the first episode and being able to get those long scenes between Jane and Rochester in, because I think many people leave them out, and that leads you to a, as we said before, a different view of their relationship, and not particularly authentic one. So I'm pleased with that, and obviously I'm pleased with the acting, and it looks great, you know, and I think Susanna has fantastic eye. And the requisite amount of scenes were set outside. I love the fact that a lot of the conversations were set outside. I mean, if there's one thing I would change, it's that the river wasn't so loud, because it's very difficult. You know, we had to dub a lot, post-sync a lot of those scenes, because the river is very difficult to control when you're cutting a scene, a long scene by the side of a river. So I would like that to be a quieter stream.
I know it's been 14 years, it seems like a really long time.
I'm very modest to say there's not much I would change, but I think you have to say to yourself, this was a group effort, you know, we tried our hardest, and they're pleased with some things, and some other things didn't quite come off. But you know, and then, as you say, move on and, you know, learn from it.
I was going to say, I know it's been 14 years and it seems like a long time, but it really does sort of stand the test of time. It seems a very timeless, ageless production. So you're saying how it looks good, and it does. We've got a question from Maria. Why do you think adaptations of the Brontes and Austen as novels written by women have garnered particular interest and never lost their position as successful heritage movies?
Well, I think because they are so very clear. I mean, Austen always, but about the intelligence and the inner life of the characters. You just always, you're always there. It's so surely plotted, and it's so absolute when you're reading it. In fact, I still read all of Austen, and I read all of Bronte, and I forget. I don't do the, you know, the professional thing, which is think, how would I dramatize it? How would I do it? I'm just always overwhelmed by the books, and I think that is what happens. People are it takes you into their landscape, and it says, you know, I'm telling you this story. And, you know, they're always great stories. They're always really brilliantly plotted. Particularly Austen is brilliantly plotted. It's very difficult to change the scenes around in a dramatization of Jane Austen, because they all lead on from each other in character development and plot development.
It's difficult to play with that structure, perhaps.
Yes, and because they are brilliant storytellers, I think, you know, and people, you know, however intellectually you might approach a show, you kind of want to sit there and be entertained. And,
right, exactly.
You know, I think they are all very entertaining, the books.
So the next question is from Laura, who asks, how did you approach Margaret Hale's character differently from Jane Eyre's?
Well, Margaret came first. So, well, Margaret, I think, was, I mean, I love North and South. It's always been one of my favourite books, so I've always loved it. So I think the main thing about Margaret was to try and make her sympathetic, because I think that she dramatised, if you're not privy to the innermost feelings, you know, and the thoughts process, then outwardly she can appear to be very snobbish. You know, she doesn't,
Yeah.
And that would be untruthful to the actual character. So I had to try and make her less dismissive of Thornton straight away, less dismissive of the North straight away, less, not callous, but outwardly insensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Because given that Thornton was going to be going the other way, that he was going to be a strong man who was very sensitive, then you need equal characters very much in that story when you're telling that story. So that would be the main. There isn't any problem in Jane Eyre because that's the character. Whereas I was very conscious of trying to make Margaret more sympathetic as a character, and Thornton slightly less. In the opening episode of that,
I think because we had some email exchanges at one point about North and South, about Margaret, and I recall you saying, she runs the risk of being unliked by a 21st century audience, and so remember that being one of your focuses, and I think that was just done brilliantly. So our next question, we just have a couple of minutes. Richard says, superb series, but why choose to allocate just over a quarter of an hour to Jane's childhood in a 4-hour adaptation when it occupies the first 10 chapters of the novel? On the other hand, you obviously have considerable knowledge of child psychology when you show Jane's traumatic reaction to her childhood memories of her aunt in a flashback when Jane is in conversation with Blanche and her entourage. So yeah, why choose to allocate just over a quarter of an hour to Jane's childhood?
Yes.
I laugh because we've discussed this.
Well, this has been mentioned before, and there were production reasons why quite a bit of what we shot of the school, but not the reads, because we got most of the reads in, and then she goes off to school. So that was one thing, but the other reason was because I very much wanted to get Jane and Rochester in to the first episode, and I wanted that big tranche of them talking to each other and becoming their relationship developing before the end of the first episode, which is the cliffhanger of him being in the burning bed. You couldn't end any sooner, the first episode, unless it had been like 10 episodes, but with a 4-part thing, you're going to have to end with the burning bed, and that meant there was less time for the childhood. But I was rather pleased to reread when I reread it the other day, just to make sure that there's one sentence in which she says the next 8 years passed at school, and then she left. So there was 8 years were in one sentence, so I didn't feel quite so bad. No. But there isn't as much as Helen and her relationship with Helen as well,
and you say it's a series, you can flesh out a lot of the novel in a series, but it's still only 4 hours. You might need sort of 25 hours to spend that much time in the childhood. Sandy, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you have to jet off, you're going to visit family. So I just want to invite everyone to unmute and to just send Sandy well on her way and thank her so much for joining us.
Brilliant.